Okay, let's take a look at federal tax revenue. This is the federal government's income from taxes. This is in 2015, so they were able to get a hold of $3.18 trillion. And if you take a look at the breakdown of where it comes from, this is us right here. Okay, this is our income tax. So over a third of it comes from, well, actually 50% comes from us. Payroll taxes are taxes that businesses pay, essentially for having employees. Corporate income taxes today, I think it dropped to 7%, somewhere in there. So we just cut our income. We just cut it. And then, miscellaneous income, fines, things like that. Customs, excise taxes. So this is where the government gets a majority of its income. So taking a look at government spending, you have taxes, student loans. It's an unlikely source. It's grown rather recently. So the debt, they collect some of the interest. And then fees for things, like tickets, or you don't really get federal tickets, but if you get like a federal fine or something like that. So what ends up happening is Congress has to set a budget, and the budget and taxation comes from the House, and then the Senate has to agree. The president can make recommendations, but it's set on what's called a fiscal year, which is a June to July budget. Businesses use a fiscal year. So if you ever hear fiscal year in terms of budget, that's what's being talked about. You have mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is spending that you must do by law. So one type is Social Security. You have Medicare as well. That's mandatory spending. And then the interest on the debt. So the bonds that are taken out, and we'll discuss that in a bit. The government takes out loans to create money, and that creates interest on the debt. You have discretionary spending, so spending that Congress just puts in the budget. They don't necessarily make a law saying we must spend money on this. It's basically, here's our budget and here's what we're going to be spending money on this year. Whereas like Social Security is a law, and Congress has to follow that law year after year until it gets changed or something. So highways, education, military, these are all discretionary spendings. Congress can any year reduce funding or increase funding on any of these things. And this is done through what's called appropriation. You're appropriating money to spend on one of these categories. And another category that isn't really, it's not rare, but the federal government interacts with the states usually through grants. So the government's like, hey, we want you to do this, and here is a bunch of money we're willing to put up if you follow our rules. And that's what you call a government grant. President Nixon, he's the guy who set the drinking age to 21 nationwide. It used to vary state to state, but he set it nationwide and to 21. And he did it by saying, if you don't set it to 20, he told the states, if you don't set it to 21, we're going to pull your state highway funding. So the states get funding to maintain their federal roads, and he just said, we'll stop giving money to maintain those roads. And all the states are like, okay, screw it, 21. Deficit spending. Deficit spending is essentially knowing you're going to spend money going into debt and you're going to have to borrow. So every year we deficit spend, and we have to borrow money through bond creation to make up that shortfall. So we're constantly going into debt. It's adding to the national debt. Once in our nation's history, we had a surplus. Well, twice, really, but the latest one was under Clinton, where we collected more tax revenue than we had spent. And I think, if I remember correctly, they just cut every taxpayer a check. So when it came time for your return, you got a little bit extra. And states more or less work the same way as the federal government with their spending. I like this picture right here where it's cut taxes, not defense. It's like, if you cut taxes, you're going to have to cut defense. Zero taxes, I don't even know how that would work. And then someone took the picture like, you get rid of your stoplight, street light, power lines, traffic sign, street sign, power for traffic light, sidewalk, road. The people standing on the things that taxes pay for, and they're like, we need to cut taxes. And I can understand the need to cut taxes. So where does the money go? This is just a visual, and I'll talk about it in class. And you can kind of answer these questions on your own. There we are. So in terms of discretionary spending, this is 2007 to 2008. This is what we spent our budget on. So we had to take out debt to pay for the Iraq War, and I think it cost us in total, between Iraq and Afghanistan, we spent $4 trillion. So one whole year's budget on the Iraq War. The Pentagon or the military chews up a large portion year after year. And then everything else, veterans is a small bit. But here's all the other spending. Here's all, like education, kind of a small chunk. Health. Health is more not Medicare, but like care for poor people. And then housing, making sure, fair housing and stuff like that. The environment, agriculture, transportation. This is your road fund right here. So it kind of gives you a sense of like where our budget priorities are. The wedge for the Pentagon is almost equal to the wedge for everything else. We'll do these in class. It's basically where would you cut. Here's how spending has changed. So like 1960, most of it was transportation. And then health became a really big chunk. It's not that people are more unhealthy. It's, we're living longer, so technically, I guess, people become more unhealthy. It's just that we found more to cure. Like if you had a brain tumor in 1960, that's it. Right? You're checking out. Today we can cut it out of your head. That gets expensive. So, it costs money. So the government tries to supplement, the cost so you don't end up losing everything just to get rid of, a tumor or something like that you could live without. So I like this cartoon right here because, here you have some young people right here. Save the schools. Education is a right, not a privilege. No tuition hikes. So they're all concerned about school, but then 20 years later, stop tax hikes. And it's kind of funny. Your priorities shift as you get older. As a taxpayer, I have to pay property taxes. So every year I pay, I think it's $4,000. And that's $4,000 I wouldn't mind having, for the year. But that money helps pay for schools and other things. So, yeah, I guess I'm paying my own salary, so I'm a little biased. But, it's important that we have, because like when I get old and get sick, it'd be nice if there were educated nurses to change my bedpan or something like that. Ew, gross. So when we take on debt, a security is basically a bond. So when we take on debt, we sell these bonds to different people. In terms of who's holding our securities, most of our debt is owned by us, or basically rich people. If you can buy, you yourself, if you have 10 grand, you can buy a government bond and they turn that into cash. But other countries can buy our bonds too, and one of the biggest buyers is China. And you may think, oh my God, China owns us. It's really not that bad of a deal. China wouldn't go to war with us because we owe them, $700 billion or $400 billion. We're not going to pay our debt if they go to war with us. So it keeps us out of war. It keeps us in good good standing with each other to a certain extent. So where does money come from? So we talked about banks loaning money in the fractional reserve. We've already talked about this. The taxes you pay were once someone's loan. Ooh, that's a tough one. How does that one work? The system is secure because loaned money ends up in a bank. So the system is secure. I mean, we talked about the Tinkerbell principle of economics. People use money, therefore money has value. But going back to the taxes you pay were once somebody's loan. When the bank gives a loan to, say, your employer, that ends up in your paycheck, and then you pay taxes, and those taxes end up basically being what the government spends. So that's basically what that statement means, and that's kind of where money comes from. And then you pay taxes, the government spends the taxes, and it pays interest on the debt, and the cycle continues. So it first starts with government bonds. The government needs money or cash. So the money you have in your wallet is the money that the government says, hey, you know what? We're really trustworthy here. If we're going to issue dollar bills, and we're going to put it in the bank, the banks are going to use them, and everywhere you go, people are going to accept it. And you can trust us because we're the United States government. And you may think, trust the United States government. We are very trustworthy. We pay our bills on time every time. And that's really what determines whether or not you're a trustworthy person. If you pay your bills 10 times out of 10, you're a great investment. So the government sells bonds to banks. Banks basically, when you say banks, it's not all banks. It's just rich people. You can buy a bond and stuff like that. But most of the time, the majority of the time, banks buy government bonds, which means that the banks hand over cash, and the bank buys a bond. It says this is what I own. Then the Federal Reserve buys those bonds. So the Federal Reserve is this separate institution, and our U.S. government is not the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is this side institution, and the Federal Reserve buys those bonds from the bank, and in exchange, they pay. So it's kind of like this. Your parents give you $20 to go to the movies. Your friend's like, hey, you know what? I'm short on cash. Can you buy my movie ticket? So you buy your movie ticket and you buy your friend's movie ticket. And in return, the next time that you go to the movies, your friend picks up your next movie ticket. So basically, if you think about it, your friend is paying you back your parents' money. It's a little tricky thinking, about it like that, but it's just an easier way to kind of think about it. So the Federal Reserve buys the bonds, and then they hand over cash to the banks. Now the thing about these bonds is there's an interest rate. So when the government sells the bonds to the bank, the government's saying, in 10 years this is going to be worth. So you give me $10,000, and in 10 years this is going to be worth $15,000. Okay, cool. So the bank's holding on these bonds, but there's really nothing they can do with the bonds. So they sell them over to the Federal Reserve, and in exchange, the Federal Reserve just gives them the cash, the value of the bond. And so basically, we owe banks the money. That's part of our national debt. So every year we pay off those bonds. So bonds from 10 years ago, we're currently paying 15 grand on. But we're also borrowing bonds every year. So if you think about it, you have 1 year where you have to pay, let's say you sell one bond for $15,000, but that's going to be in 10 years. Every year, year 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to year 9, you're collecting $10,000. And then every year you roll over and pay 15. and you just you end up borrowing more than you're paying off, and that's what makes bonds very valuable too. Is you know that the person paying you is never going to run out of money buying those bonds and selling those bonds. So let's put this in order. The government sells bonds. Okay, they say, hey, we got some bonds for sale. The banks buy them. Okay, and this just helps if you just kind of like at first just don't question why it happens this way. Just understand that it happens this way. Okay, and then we can kind of work on the understanding of why it works this way. So the government sells bonds. Hey, I got bonds for sale. Banks buy them. Okay, the Federal Reserve, which is not the government, it was set up by the government, but it is not the government. They buy the bonds from the banks. So right now, the government is still on the hook, okay? The people who collect taxes, the government, they're still on the hook for the bonds that were initially sold. I mean, when they finally make them come due, you're essentially paying the Federal Reserve, and the banks get their money because the Federal Reserve is buying the bonds. So the Federal Reserve then prints money, and that's how they, when the Federal Reserve buys the bonds, the Federal Reserve prints money and hands the cash over to the banks. Then the banks loan out cash. The loans become someone's pay. That income is taxed, and then the government gets the money to spend. Okay? And then they continue to sell bonds. And part of the money, the 6%, part of the money that is spent on the bonds is paying off the bonds, basically. So that's part of the budget, through taxation and all that stuff, is paying off the bonds that they've already sold. And then they continue to sell bonds, and that's why the national debt just keeps going up. It goes up basically for two reasons. We keep selling bonds to pay for things, to increase the money supply. And the other reason is the deficit spending, where we spend too much money in a single year and have to make it up by selling more bonds. So one way is to increase the money supply, and the other way is because we just go over budget when we spend money. So let's take a look at the Fed. Keep talking about the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve was basically set up by the government, say government corporation, and so the government allows it to exist. But it's gonna run like a business, okay? And that way it can do business with the banks. So the Federal Reserve enters into a relationship with the banks. Hey, banks, you guys would like to make money, wouldn't you? You guys would like to loan out money and make money off those loans, right? Yeah, of course. All right. But to do that, you need money. You need money that people can trust. If you issue your own money saying, this is a Wells Fargo dollar bill, not everyone can trust that. Who's Wells Fargo? Are they going to go out of business? All these questions surrounding whether or not you write your own paper money, and somehow people are supposed to trust that. So I have an idea. The government's selling these bonds. In 10 years, we buy them for $10,000, and in 10 years, they'll be worth $15,000. It's pretty awesome. So we're going to buy these bonds. You're going to buy these bonds from the federal government. Okay? Then you get the 6%, right? In 10 years, you're going to get 15 grand from the government. Cool. All right. And you know what we're going to do too? You sell those bonds to us, and we'll give you cash. And with that cash, you can loan that money out. So not only do you get the 6% on the bonds, but you also get whatever interest rate you want on your loans. It could be 3%, 10%, 20%. Doesn't matter. So technically a bank, when they make money off of bonds that they sell, sell over to the Federal Reserve. So they're getting that 6%. And they also make money off the loans that they give. So they're kind of like double dipping the cash supply. But the banks have to give up some freedom. One thing the Fed does is it regulates banks. It basically sets what's called it sets interest rates, saying, you know what, banks, you guys are loaning out too much money. We are going to raise interest rates. And so that loan of $1,000, the interest rate is going to be much higher. And that's going to make that less attractive to people who want to borrow money. Because right now you're loaning out too much money. You loan out too much money, you may not be loaning out money to trustworthy people. And if these trustworthy people don't pay you back, you're going to go out of business. So we're going to raise interest rates, and you have to raise your interest rates too. Okay? Otherwise, our whole deal that we had going isn't going to work. You have to raise your interest rates. The banks go, okay. Another thing they do is they set the reserve requirement, which is kind of similar to raising interest rates, where if a bank is only required to keep 5% of its cash in its vault, then it's going to loan out 95% of whatever they bring in through deposits. That might be too much money out in the economy. People might be spending it too much. They might be going out and buying houses that they can barely afford. If they lose their job, if enough people lose their job, there goes the housing market. And that's what happened in 2008, 2010. So if the Federal Reserve says, you know what, we're going to set interest rates to 10%, and we're going to require you to keep 20% of your deposits in your vault. Well, banks aren't going to be, it's going to be less attractive to people taking out loans like that. You're not going to take out a loan that expensive. You're never going to be able to pay that back. So what that does is it reels in all of the credit that's out there in the economy, because too much credit can damage an economy. We've seen that over and over. It also blocks mergers. So it'll probably say that Wells Fargo can't buy Bank of America, things like that. If Bank of America wanted to buy Wells Fargo, they'd probably say no. It regulates connections between American banks and foreign banks. Foreign banks don't always have to follow the rules. It could be that, we have a war on drugs right now. And what if a foreign bank does business with El Chapo? And then Bank of America wants to do business with this foreign bank. Essentially, Bank of America is profiting and doing business off of drug lords. The Federal Reserve might have trouble with that. So they say, you can't do business with that bank. And it oversees consumer borrowing. So like I said, too much credit out in the economy, that can tank an economy. Credit is basically, can I trust you to pay me back? And not every, if you came up to me and said, hey, Clayson, could I have a $10,000 loan? I'm going to, get out of here. Come on. I don't even trust you can pay me back ever. But, when you get rich and famous, and you're like, hey, Clayson, could I have a $10,000 loan? I don't know why you'd come to me for $10,000, but let's just say, yeah, I'm pretty trustworthy. If you think about it, and I probably already said this in class, if you have $1, you're technically richer than I am right now. But which one of us can go out and buy a car? That's because credit. I have more credit than you. I pay my bills. You have no bills to pay, so you have zero credit. Banks don't even know what kind of credit risk you are because you haven't demonstrated any sort of responsibility paying bills yet. Not your fault. Well, when you're 18, you'll start seeing what paying bills is like. They act as the government's bank. They hold the government's money, sell government bonds and treasury bills, and then the national currency. And we talked all about that before on the previous slides, how that works. Changes in the money supply. So the discount rate is the interest rate, basically. So banks charge an interest rate. If you go in for a loan, they're like, yeah, this is at 5%. And it's at 5% because the Federal Reserve probably says interest rates are at 4%, things like that. I basically refied my house, which is basically like you get a mortgage and you get into your house. That's what you initially do. Sometimes the value of your house goes up. So if I initially bought for $200,000 and I took out a mortgage for $200,000, I can borrow against my house if the value goes up. So if the value of the house is $400,000, 5 years later, I'm sitting on property that's worth $200,000. Awesome. I want to redo my kitchen, so I go to a bank and I say, hey, you know what? I want to redo my kitchen, but I need $10,000. I'd like to refinance my house, which is almost like you get a new mortgage, basically. And you want to shop rates. So you go to a bank and it's like, Wells Fargo is going to give me 4%. Bank of America is going to give me 3.7. And you're like, oh, what's the difference between 0.3%? It's a lot of money because mortgages, I mean, like, $800,000, but that 0.3% works out to be thousands of dollars. And I mean, who wouldn't want to save? I mean, I'm paying my mortgage $2,000 every month. If over the course of my mortgage, I get to save like 50, $100 every month, why not? I can put that 50 to $100, to work buying Starbucks or something. So, just a little decimal point in interest rates really makes a difference. And then the reserve requirement, we've already talked about that and talked about how the Fed uses those two things to limit, how much credit is out in the economy. The government buying or selling bonds, the government isn't always like, buy bonds, we'll sell you any bond, just come on over. If you buy, we'll sell. No, I mean, sometimes, the Federal Reserve tells the government, whoa, 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 whoa. We have too much out there. Okay, so let's limit the amount of bonds we're selling right now. There's too much money out in the economy. It's causing inflation. Let the economy grow a little bit and need the money that we have out there, and then we can go back to selling bonds. So there's a lot they have to watch. They have to watch, like how much loans are going out. They have to, they have to adjust interest rates, and it takes a lot of like prediction. If there's a lot of credit out there, but unemployment's like high, you don't want banks sending out more loans if wages are like really low. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. If people aren't bringing in income and they're buying houses, I mean, like that's going to collapse an economy. So all of these policies, it adds up to what you call monetary policy. So fiscal policy, you have monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy just pertains to like the federal budget. So there's things that the federal government can do to help an economy. One is cutting taxes. So you can, if you want to prevent consumer spending, you would raise taxes, but the government doesn't raise taxes just to control consumer spending. The main thing the government does is they'll raise taxes if they need to like pay for things, but like services, so like you increase spending, you have to raise taxes. Maybe you need more programs. Maybe one of these days we'll get around to fighting global warming, and it might be a good idea if the government raises taxes. It'll raise taxes on like anybody who, let's say that you have a gasoline engine. Maybe, states raise taxes on gasoline, or the federal government tells states to raise taxes on gasoline, and that prevents people from using gasoline engines. The government can also, like, if you buy an electric car, we'll give you $10,000. Well, that $10,000 doesn't poof out of thin air. That has to be raised up in taxes, so that's increasing spending. Cuts in taxes, it puts more money in your pocket. Anytime the government says, hey, you know what, we're going to cut taxes, well, that's more money you have at the end of the month when you get your paycheck. So you have two types of monetary policy. You have easy monetary policy and tight money policy. Easy monetary policy, easy meaning like it's easy to get a hold of cash, okay? Like you as a consumer can get a hold of cash easily. A business can get a hold of cash easily through loans and things like that. So interest rates are low, which increases the flow of money, but that increases prices because if money is out there, businesses want to grab as much as possible. So prices will go up, competition goes up because you have more businesses wanting your money. This causes inflation. The more money you have out in the economy, the more inflation you have. So to control inflation, you might go back to a tight monetary policy, which is where, the price of bread is $7 right now because we have all this cash out in the economy. So basically what the Federal Reserve does is when the cash goes through the bank, the Federal Reserve raises the reserve requirement, And either banks hold on to the cash, or basically the Federal Reserve takes the cash out of the economy, just goes to the bank and says, we're bringing this cash back in and we're going to store it until we determine whether or not, things are going to recuperate. And so interest rates go up, and so that lowers the money flow. And, prices go down and competition goes down because everything's kind of like, calming down. So you have two types of stabilization policies. We talked about supply and demand. So supply is business, demand is us, the regular people. They stabilize the economy by increasing decreases demand through fiscal policy. And then supply side stabilize the economy by increasing output, lower unemployment by increasing production. So you see hints of what demand side policy looks like and supply side policies look like through what effect they have on the economy. If you see employment lowering, that's probably because the federal government enacted a policy that affects businesses. So monetary policy, you have that as well. Those mix in with demand side policies and supply side policies. So there are policies that help the consumer, and there are policies that help businesses, like lowering the corporate income tax, corporate income tax. That helps businesses. That doesn't necessarily help us. That just helps businesses. But if you cut taxes for people who make an income between $40,000 and $100,000, that's only going to help demand. That's only going to help you and me. That's not going to help corporations. So demand side policies, usually you see more spending. They cut taxes on the middle class, raise the minimum wage. You see an increase in government spending. Supply side policy, lower taxes on the top earners and corporations. The idea behind that is if you lower taxes, they're going to have more cash to invest, and with that investment. So this is always sort of almost political. This gets really political. It isn't like economics where, hey, this makes sense, we should do this. This gets kind of political because, if you think about it, if you go to Target and there's like a long line, what do? They open up another check stand because there is a demand to check out. So let's say you lower taxes on the middle class. That puts more money in our pocket, in which case we're going to go out and spend that money. So who's creating jobs? Is it by cutting taxes on the corporation or the people waiting in line at Target? Target's going to go, man, we need more checkers. Well, all right. Well, there you go. There's a job. Now on the supply side, if you cut taxes, if you tell a rich person, look, we're not going to take as much money from you as we used to, that rich person might be like, okay, cool. I get another jet. What kind of job does that create if you order another jet? I'm going to drop another $20 million on an airplane. That doesn't really create a job. That just, that just makes the airplane company produce one more airplane. That doesn't really, create jobs. But on supply side, you have it, and this is kind of what fuels supply side economics, or the idea behind supply side economics is at a certain point, you can tax people so high that they're going to stop spending money. All right, taking a look at the national debt. The national debt itself, it's a little odd. It's not like personal debt where, you take out loans or something like that and you owe a bank $50,000 and you owe $10,000 on a credit card and things like that. We talked about credit before, and the United States has a tremendous amount of credit. Credit is essentially how trustworthy are you to pay your bills. And the United States pays its bills 10 times out of 10. Now, I am less of a credit risk than you are. I can go out and buy a car tomorrow if I wanted to. You couldn't. I could go out and buy a pretty nice car tomorrow. You could probably buy, an old Beater or something like that, or something at the junkyard that you have to fix up. So, I am a better you are more of a credit risk than I am. The United States is the least riskiest credit risk ever. So one of the things that we'll see the national debt sort of scares people because it's like, oh my God, look at how much debt we're in. But that debt is essentially our money supply. So if we were to like pay off the debt or something like that, it basically eliminates our money supply. So it would be extremely detrimental if we paid our debt and paid it down to zero. Is there too much debt? Well, it doesn't matter. If people are loaning us money, who cares how high our debt goes? It's when we stop paying our bills. It's when people stop buying our bonds that we need to worry about the national debt. Because if I'm not that big of a credit risk and I carry debt, and I do carry debt, my debt isn't a problem because I make my payments. And when I die, my debt goes away. So it's really not a problem. With the United States, I mean, we can be $400 quadrillion in debt. If people are still buying our bonds, okay. It's when people stop buying our bonds. And if all of a sudden we couldn't pay our bills, it would probably collapse the world economy because so many people depend on us paying them for what they invested in. So, yeah, national debt really isn't a problem. If you hear about the national debt being a problem, I mean, you are now educated on how the national debt works. So sometimes in politics, politicians like to bring up the national debt and go, boogity, 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 you know, and vote for me and I'll lower it. And it's like, dude, you don't even know how it works. The national debt is not personal debt. Anyways, that concludes the unit, and there you are.